Hello everyone and welcome to K Gutte's online lecture series. You are here with myself KW Gutte, your course educator. Great to see you here again in this lecture series. Today we are going to discuss a Roman critic, Horace. Horace, his full name is Quintus Horatius Flaccus. He was born on December 65 BC, Venetia, Italy, and he died on November 27, 8th BC at Rome. Horace was an outstanding lyric poet, a Roman poet and critic. He was a satirist who lived under the emperor of Augustus. Horace came nearly 2 centuries after Aristotle. He represents Roman classical criticism. The most frequent themes of his odes and verse epistles are love, friendship, philosophy, and the art of poetry. He lived in the glorious period in Roman history that is the Augustan age. Horace was the contemporary of great poet Virgil. He is the author of Aeneid and Ovid. Now we'll discuss Ars Poetica. Ars Poetica is about art of poetry. This treatise is in brief and this is in 3 sections. First section is about excellence. It talks about qualities of poetry, qualities of poet, and especially qualities of unity, brevity, order, and avoidance of purple patches. It talks about the limits of writer. A writer should know his limits and he should confine to his limits. He should not take unmanageable flights when he is writing. And second section talks about the different kind of poetry and the form of poetry. It is the main part of the treatise Ars Poetica. It talks about different kinds of poetry and the form of poetry. In this second section, there is a plank, there is a main plank of criticism. It discusses about the propriety and rules. And in section 3, Horace gives a friendly counsel to young poets about writing, how to write. He talks about a relationship between matter and form, poetry and poet. What is the relationship between matter and form? And what is the relationship between poetry and poet? He talks about the relationship between these matter, form, and poetry and poet. Horace's criticism follows ancient classical line. Often he finds direct transcript from Aristotle. He follows the Greek masters, especially Aristotle, and being a great admirer of a great Greek models, he follows the guidelines about the literature from the Greek authors and Greek models. Now let's talk about Horace's observations on poetry. His first observation on poetry is about nature of poetry. The poet is called as an imitator. He must address himself, his life and manner. But poetry, it is called as mere imitation. But mere imitation is not the nature of poetry. Just imitation is not the nature of poetry. Poet often uses fiction and mingles facts with fancy. Poet uses imagination, but he mingles facts with imagination. But imagination and fancy or fiction must be very close to the truth. Truth and imagination should be balanced. There should be balance between truth and imagination. There should not be only imagination, but there should be truth with imagination, and there should be balance. Horace says, inconsistent things must not be joined. For example, purple patch. Purple patches are being added into the literary text. These are figurative references, figurative language to add the attraction to the literary text. But such purple patches should be avoided as Horace talks about. These should be avoided. Horace talks about judicious combination of truth and fiction. There should be combination of truth and fiction. It should be judicious and the content must be credible. Though it is a product of imagination, the literature or the poetry is supposed as a product of imagination, but there should be credible content. There should be some truth in it. Horace's second observation on poetry is about aim or function of poetry. Horace is an advocator of Greek model. He thinks the main object of the poetry should be to instruct as well as delight. But to achieve this purpose, the form of poetry should not be compromised. There should be some teaching as well as it should give some delight to the reader. But the form of poetry should not be compromised. And poetry must combine pleasure with profit. There should not be only pleasure, but there should be some kind of profit. There should be some usefulness of poetry. A work of poet must aim at sublimation, that is, the use of language and description that excites thoughts and emotions beyond ordinary experience. Great poetry should have pleasure and morality improving elements. Only pleasure is not required, but according to Horace, the function of poetry should be to improve the moral elements among the readers. Poetry should be to charm the mind. It should give the charm to the mind. But this charge should not consist just beauty of form, but poet's power to move readers' heart and soul. Poetry should move the heart of reader and soul of the reader. Poetry should have beauty and it must be pleasing. Horace welcomes its appeal to emotions to make literature more serviceable to society. Horace's next observation on poetry is about subject and theme of poetry. Theme must be simple and familiar materials. Subject should be from life, customs, and traditions. The form, subject, and art of the poet must cooperate to one another. Horace thinks that the subject or the theme of poetry or literature should be familiar. It should be related to life, custom, and traditions. And the form of the poetry, subject of the poetry, and the art of the poet, these three things must cooperate to each other. Horace says, if you wish me to weep, you must first express real sorrow. If an author wants reader to weep by reading something, for that he should write the real expression of sorrow. Then only he can get this effect. Poet should maintain uniformity and there should not be irrelevant to the subject matter. The suitability of the theme to author's condition of the poetic art. So there should be uniformity about the subject matter. Horace says that there should not be irrelevant things, irrelevant to the subject matter. And he says, one who chooses the subject wisely, the one who chooses the subject wisely, the author who chooses the subject wisely will find that neither words nor lucid arrangement fail. If he selects the subject wisely, his words will not fail and his arrangements of words even will not fail. There should be sound judgment in the source of good writing. His next observation about poetry is about types of poetry, and he follows ancient Greek tradition, especially Aristotle. He believes that poetry has settled kinds appropriate to each author. As he accepts old Greek practice, there should be affinity between meter and the subject matter of each kind. Epic, elegy, tragedy, comedy, and lyric satire. These are the types of poetry of his times, and afterwards sonnets and novels. The epic he considers a rightful meter to be employed by Homer, that is dactylic hexameter. Dactylic hexameter has to be used to the epic, and for mournful elegy and songs of thanksgiving, the elegiac measure should be used. For tragedy, comedy, and satirical verses, the iambic meter, which has conversational ease, should be used. Horace claims that his favorite form, the satire, was a new kind. It was unknown to the Greeks. That these kinds of literary forms are eternally fixed and must change with life and custom. These forms of literature should change according to the course of time and life and customs. In his own country, later, a new form of poetry was born, and that was sonnet. It was a different from lyric. And in England, at the same time, there was a new kind of literature was evolved, and that was a ballad, a narrative poetry. And in 18th century, the novel was evolved, a new kind of literature was evolved, and Horace proceeds from his respect for ancients. Horace's next observation is about language of poetry. Like Aristotle, Horace emphasizes on the right choice of words and their effectiveness and the arrangement of words in the composition. He thinks that there should be the right choice of words in the composition of poetry so that these words will be effective. Poet is free to use different kind of words, familiar words or newly coined words to have clarity and effectiveness in the poetry. And familiar words or the words which are being used in the poetry have the tremendous power when used skillfully. When a poet uses familiar words, these familiar words have a tremendous power according to Horace when it is used skillfully. So that diction will be excellent with the combination of familiar words and with the newly coined words. And when familiar words can be used, a poet can coin new words, and lately coined words descend from Greek source with slight modification. When there is no choice of word before the poet, he can use the Greek words or the archaic words, or even he can have a slight modification in the words. Words have their birth, death, and resurrection. As a person, a newly coined words is a birth of a word. The words that are not being used is a death of word, and the words that are not been used for a long time, but again these words are been used, is the resurrection of words. So he says the words have their birth, death and resurrection. Horace talks about appropriateness of poetic vocabulary. The vocabulary may be familiar words, newly coined words, and archaic words, and these words can be used according to the demand of usage. Poet's skill lies in making familiar words strange and strange words familiar. A poet should have skill that he should make the words, familiar words, appear strange, and strange words may look like the familiar words. So it is a skill of a poet. When he uses these words in his poetry, these should be a very dramatically used to have the excellent diction of the poetry, excellent composition of the poetry. So such kind of language of poetry should be there. And next, he talks about nature and art of poetry. Horace examines a question about the place of genius and art in the success of poetry. Genius is about natural endowment, and art is about training in the literary art. So both of these are important as far as poetic composition is concerned. Horace thinks study cannot profit without genius, or skill without training. So skill will not work without training. So training should be required. So each gift, that may be genius, that may be skill or training or study, each of these should work with other. Then only it will work. No one can be a great poet without natural gift, and unless he undertakes necessary toil, necessary efforts to learn the principles of his poetic art, he will not be a good poet. Hence, Horace is concerned about toil than the natural genius. He lays down the rules of efforts, rules of toil, which can submit to discipline of rules. He considers poetry as a mere matter of rules than genius. So it is a matter of rules. Poetry is a matter of rules than the genius. He thinks he gives more importance to the rules and the efforts, and he does not support genius unless it is subjected to a proper training. If a person is genius but he has no proper training, he will not able to write, or he will not able to compose a good poetic composition or good poetic art. So this is about nature and art of poetry. The next video lecture will be on Horace's observation on drama, its plot, characterization and style. So thank you for watching K. Gupte's online lecture series, A Smart Way of Learning. If you like this video, you can hit the like button. You can share this video with other students and academicians, and you can subscribe this channel to watch more educational videos. Thank you.